Chapter 15. True Friends. Jack Platt, a veteran CIA clandestine officer, and Gennady Vasilyenko, a seasoned KGB counterspy, were on opposite sides of the espionage battles. But they forged a remarkable friendship that transcended the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and for the Russian, years of harsh imprisonment by the KGB. The two met in 1977 at an unlikely venue, a Harlem Globetrotters basketball game in Washington. Vasilyenko was a tall, broad-shouldered, athletic man who loved sports and hunting. In the Soviet embassy, Vasilyenko's cover job was public relations officer. He actually worked in Line KR, the KGB's counterintelligence arm. Vasilyenko's tennis partner, an FBI agent, told him about a friend he should meet. He said he was a guy who liked shooting and hunting and was a real cowboy, Vasilyenko later recalled. The cowboy was Jack Platt, whose job was to try to recruit KGB agents to work for the CIA. The crowd noise in the arena would shield their conversation. Both the CIA and the FBI, of course, knew that Vasilyenko was a KGB officer. The CIA called him Glazing. The FBI and the CIA gave him a joint cryptonym, Monolite. The two men immediately hit it off, and against all odds found that they liked each other. Over the years, Platt repeatedly tried to recruit Vasilyenko, but the KGB man would have none of it. He laughed off and brushed aside all of Platt's repeated efforts to get him to change sides. Jack Platt was not a typical CIA officer. Although a tough-minded ex-Marine, he was warm, funny, and affable. He was also irreverent and outspoken, not qualities that endeared him to his bureaucratic superiors. He was a Texan, born in San Antonio in 1936 and graduated from Williams College before joining the Marines for 3 years. Like many ex-Marines, he was intensely loyal to the Corps throughout his life. While in the Marines in 1959, he married Paige Gordon, and they reared 3 daughters. In 1963, he joined the CIA, which sent him to Vienna in 1966 for 5 years. The Austrian capital, the setting for Graham Greene's Cold War classic, The Third Man, was a favorite hunting ground for spies. It was pretty much a free-for-all, Platt recalled, with the Russians and other intelligence services all headquartered there. After service in Laos, he was sent to Paris in 1975. After 2 years, he was back in Washington. During those years and later, he was a Soviet targets officer, meaning his principal job was to try to recruit Russians and their intelligence officers. Gennady Vasilyenko was a kindred spirit of Jack Platt, although for him the risks of their friendship were much more perilous. He was born in December 1941 in Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, in eastern Siberia, during World War II. His father served in the military and was wounded in the war when Russia fought Japan in the Kuril Islands. One of his earliest childhood memories came when his father killed a bear and brought home the cub as a playmate for the children. Bears grow quickly, however. On a summer day, we were playing outside near a small pond, and the bear almost drowned me, Vasilyenko recalled. I was lucky. A soldier was passing by and saved my life. The same day, my father killed the bear. After the war, Gennady and his mother moved to her native village near Moscow. His father was sent to East Germany by the military. In the village, the war left only women and a few children. The children had to do the men's jobs in order to survive. There was no electricity, no gas in the village of 11 houses. To go to school, we had to walk 2 miles on foot in any kind of weather, or skate on the river covered with ice. Life improved when, at age 10, his uncle returned from the war and took him hunting, the start of Vasilyenko's lifelong love of the sport. His mother found a job, and with Gennady moved to Moscow. In high school, he enjoyed his love of shooting, skiing, skating, hockey, soccer, and gymnastics. But volleyball was his favorite sport, and he made the all-star Moscow team. By the time he graduated from college and engineering school, he was a world-class volleyball player. He was invited to play for Dynamo, the volleyball team made up mostly of KGB officers. Two of his teammates on Dynamo worked for the First Chief Directorate, the department in charge of spying overseas, and urged Vasilyenko to join the KGB. He had hoped instead to go to the 1964 Olympics in Tokyo on the Soviet volleyball team, but he injured his shoulder while practicing in Czechoslovakia. His Olympic hopes dashed, he joined the KGB, first as a civilian engineer working in computers and intelligence, and in 1971 as an officer. He was sent to the Andropov Institute near Moscow for 3 years of espionage training, and was assigned to the First Chief Directorate in Yasenevo, outside Moscow, where the KGB's foreign spies operated from a headquarters complex that bore a striking resemblance to the CIA's headquarters in Northern Virginia. His posting to Washington followed in 1976. Intelligence work was partly a family tradition. His father had been an officer in the KGB's Second Chief Directorate, which carried out surveillance of foreigners in the capital. He worked in Washington for 6 years, under cover in the Soviet embassy. It was while there that he met Jack Platt. When Vasilyenko was leaving Washington in 1981 to return to Moscow and the First Chief Directorate, Platt invited him and his family to come for a farewell drink. The KGB man asked his superiors for permission. He was told not to go and came anyway, Platt said. Platt had not lost hope of recruiting his friend. I said, "When you come out, I'll find you." In March 1984, he went to Guyana and I went there. Platt found Vasilyenko through a phone call. Gennady had called the SMUN, the Soviet mission to the UN, and instead of saying, "Hey guys, it's me, Gennady," he said his full name. Platt interpreted the phone call to mean that Vasilyenko, knowing that the FBI would be listening, was signaling Platt where he was. Guyana, a small South American republic tucked in next to Venezuela, was first settled by the Dutch in the 17th century, then became British Guiana in 1831, and an independent country in 1970. For Vasilyenko, it was a backwater that did not offer much of an espionage challenge. It was a boring assignment compared to his previous time in Washington. But it gave Platt the chance he had been waiting for to recontact his friend. In October 1987, Platt flew to Guyana and again met with Vasilyenko, once more trying to recruit the KGB man, who was happy to see his friend but again turned him down. Platt did not give up. He said he would return to Guyana, and they arranged to meet there again in February on Platt's birthday. A copy of Platt's October cable to CIA about his meeting with Vasilyenko in Guyana fell into Hansen's hands. Hansen misunderstood the cable. He thought it meant that Vasilyenko had been recruited by the CIA, which was not the case. On November 23rd, in an exchange at Dead Drop Park, Hansen erroneously reported to the KGB that Vasilyenko was a source working for American intelligence. Hansen, by misinterpreting the cable and passing it to the KGB, had placed yet another life at risk. In reply, the KGB left $20,000 for Hansen in the dead drop. On February 8, 1988, there was another exchange at the dead drop. The Russians left an additional $25,000 for Hansen, along with a personal letter of thanks from KGB Chairman Vladimir Khrushchev. Vasilyenko could not afford to report his encounter in Guyana with Platt to Moscow headquarters. He had become entirely too friendly with Platt. When a KGB officer is pitched by the CIA, he is required to report it, and then is almost always recalled to Moscow to remove him from temptation. To avoid a recall and having to explain his actions to the KGB, Vasilyenko never reported the meeting. But Hansen had. In January 1988, 2 months after Hansen put Platt's cable in the dead drop, Vasilyenko was told to report to the KGB in Havana. But Gennady often had to go to Havana from Guyana, Platt explained, to write the classified annex to their annual report to Moscow, because Guyana was not considered a safe residency. It was not approved as safe for Kamo, so he did not think it unusual to be summoned to Havana. When Vasilyenko landed in Havana, he was met not by the KGB friend he expected, but by another officer who escorted him to a house where he was told he would stay during his visit. As soon as Vasilyenko walked through the front door, he was jumped by two KGB goons who broke his arm, slammed him to the floor, leaving a gash in his head, and accused him of treason. He was sent back to Moscow, thrown into Lefortovo prison, and interrogated for 6 months. Lefortovo was a notorious place where spy suspects seldom left alive. Many were executed there with a single shot in the back of the head. At Lefortovo, the interrogation of Vasilyenko was relentless. "We know you are a CIA spy," they warned. "There's no use to deny it. We have the evidence." Then his interrogators rolled out their trump card. They lied and told him they had a tape recording of him with Jack Platt in Guyana. But Vasilyenko knew it was not true, because Platt had promised him he would never record their conversations. The KGB also put 3 informers in his cell, but Vasilyenko knew who they were. He told them nothing, because he had nothing to tell. Vasilyenko, who was innocent, escaped the fate of many prisoners at Lefortovo. After 6 months of harsh questioning, he was finally released for lack of evidence, fired from the KGB, and left on the streets of Moscow with no pension and no job. There was a reason, never disclosed publicly, that Vasilyenko was let out of Lefortovo. In Washington, Vasilyenko had been the case officer for Ronald Pelton, the NSA man who volunteered super-secret information to the KGB about Ivy Bells. In that operation, the NSA had tapped into a Soviet undersea communications cable in the Sea of Okhotsk. It was Vasilyenko who gave Pelton his KGB codename, Long. Soon after Pelton walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington to offer his services, Vasilyenko reconnoitered the NSA man's home. He drove by a street named Long and chose that as Pelton's codename. During Vasilyenko's interrogation, he was able to argue convincingly that if he had really been recruited to work for U.S. intelligence, he would long ago have betrayed Pelton to the CIA and the FBI. It was the KGB agent Vitaly Yurchenko, who defected for a time in 1985, who had provided the leads that led the U.S. authorities to Pelton. Platt learned of Vasilyenko's arrest in 1988. But did not know who had betrayed him. The arrest of Aldrich Ames in 1994 pointed to one possible answer. But Platt was dubious that Ames was responsible, since Ames was in Rome in 1987 and would have been unlikely to see the cable from Guyana. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Platt was overjoyed to learn that Vasilyenko had survived prison. In a remarkable post-Cold War story, the two went into business together in 1993. Vasilyenko became Platt's partner in the Hamilton Trading Group, Inc., their private security company with offices in McLean, Virginia, and Moscow. But the KGB and the Russian Gulag were not done with him yet. In fact, his ordeal had just begun. In 2005, he was imprisoned again for almost 5 years on trumped-up charges of possession of guns and explosives, and a bizarre claim that he had tried to assassinate an official of Gazprom, the giant Russian natural gas company. Guns and ammunition were planted in his garage. Explosives were spread on the steering wheel of his truck, and he was made to drive the truck to the police so that the residue would be found on his hands. The attempted murder charge was dropped, but he was sentenced to 3 years for alleged illegal possession of firearms and explosives. His sentence was extended for another 2.5 years after the police claimed he had bribed someone to get a cell phone. He was arrested on August 25, 2005, the start of his 5-year nightmare. He was beaten almost every day and subjected to physical and psychological cruelties beginning on the day of his arrest. The official in charge of Vasilyenko's interrogation during this second, longer time in the grip of the Russian prison system was no ordinary KGB official. Alexander Sasha Zhomov was a senior officer of the KGB's Second Chief Directorate, directly responsible for the surveillance of Americans in Moscow. It was Zhomov who gave orders that Vasilyenko be beaten in prison, and Zhomov, who personally led the harsh interrogations of Vasilyenko, was embarrassingly well known to the CIA. He had led the agency on a wild goose chase for 3 years. It had begun in 1987, when the CIA's Moscow station chief, Jack Downing, was approached as he traveled to Leningrad aboard the Red Arrow, the crack train from Moscow. He was handed an envelope by a stranger who said in his letter he was a KGB officer willing to spy for the U.S. He proposed they communicate in the future by messages he would drop in Downing's unlocked car while the CIA station chief and his wife had dinner at a restaurant inside. The CIA gave him the code name GT Prologue. At CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, the debate raged. Opinions were split among the leaders of the Soviet division. Was GT Prologue a dangle under KGB control, sent to deceive the CIA? Or was he a real volunteer? But the Russian was providing some useful information, so the decision was made to run him. From a defector, the CIA learned that GT Prologue's true name was Alexander Zhomov. For 3 years, the espionage dance continued. Finally, they decided to test Zhomov by offering to exfiltrate him from Moscow. He was given an American passport and a new identity, and told he was to escape from Russia by traveling from Estonia on a ferry to Helsinki. But he never showed up on the ferry, and sent an angry message saying the plan had endangered his life, and he was breaking contact with the CIA. It was clear in 1990 that Zhomov had been under KGB control all along. Although Vasilyenko was now in prison on various new false charges, Zhomov undoubtedly hoped he could extract a confession that Vasilyenko was an American spy, as the KGB suspected when Hansen had falsely accused him of working for the CIA. But in prison, Vasilyenko had a dramatic weapon he used against his oppressors. In prison, he kept a diary to document his torments. At the time of my arrest, and before the eyes of my young children and elderly sick mother, he wrote, I was subjected to humiliation and beating by armed guards in masks. Beginning at 10 o'clock in the morning, when I was beaten and detained, and continuing until 9 o'clock in the evening, they, his mother and children, were with me without food or water, and in the custody of the armed men in masks. As a result of the beatings that day and the subsequent harsh interrogations, I lost my hearing and acquired a damaged knee joint. My leg was swollen and caused me unbearable pain. The abuse continued even when he was en route to a court hearing. I was thrown face down on the dirty floor of a car. One of the guards constantly kept his foot on my head or my back. I was held that way for 6 hours, 3 hours to the court and 3 hours back. For some of the beatings, the prison authorities subcontracted the work to other violent criminals. I was kept in a cell of individuals convicted for murder, violence, robbery, etc., who had been instructed to assault me. At one point in 2008, he was held for a week in a tomb without windows, without ventilation, and without water and food, without a toilet, bucket, without exercise. In the Gulag, he was constantly moved and placed in solitary confinement 8 times, all as part of his punishment. For 8 months after his arrest, he was held in 4 different prisons, and that pattern continued. For a month in the spring of 2008, he was held in a prison in Bor, and then placed in solitary there for 4 months. In August, he was moved for a week to the prison in Nizhny Novgorod, but a month later he was back in solitary in Bor. Then in September, he was shuttled back to Nizhny Novgorod and back to Bor for a 4th bout of solitary. In October, he was moved once again to Nizhny Novgorod, then another week of solitary in Bor. And it continued that way that fall, with him moved back and forth between the 2 prisons and 3 more solitary confinements. The majority of these relocations made no sense, he wrote in his diary. I was taken through these steps only with the goals of humiliation and psychological and physical pressure. Relocated from place to place, I was forced to carry my personal belongings with me, even those that I was not allowed to use. In describing the prison system, Vasilyenko portrayed a structure of corruption in which the authorities and the favored inmates participated together. Once in the correctional institution, he wrote, each arrival stays for 2 weeks in quarantine, which is headed by criminal elements from among those close to the administration. Individual so-called work is carried out with each person, including physical and moral violence. Depending on the well-being of the convict, he is forced to contribute a round sum from 50,000 to 150,000 rubles, and more to the charitable fund of the prison. He is also required to pay off favored inmates in the form of products, clothing, cash deposits, etc. If the prisoner does not agree to this, then to begin with, he is heavily beaten and threatened that such beatings will continue until the end of his prison sentence. For those who still do not cooperate, false charges are made that results in additional prison term. The most privileged inmates are those who collaborate with the administration of the prison. This category of individuals has separate living quarters and the opportunity to get any food products, including fresh meat, poultry, and vegetables. At their disposal are microwave ovens, grills, electric stoves, televisions, video and audio equipment, and even mobile phones. This category of persons can also go home once per year, sometimes for an additional payment. But for most, prison was a grim, hopeless existence. During Vasilyenko's time in the prison in Bor, one accused prisoner was killed, one allegedly hanged himself, and one was half beaten to death, struck with a chain on the head, and broke several ribs. As a mark of protest against the lawlessness, convicts went on hunger strikes and slit their wrists. One prisoner cut off his hand with a circular saw and brought it to the duty officer. All these protests, even those few that with the help of a family member made their way to a court or prosecutor, were to no avail. In short, the Gulag was a corrupt enterprise, from which most were never free. There was little Platt could do to help Vasilyenko, although he kept up a barrage of emails to their friends, reporting on each new twist in the case. It was a dark period for the 2 men. But a better day was coming. Before Vasilyenko was sent to the Gulag, he and Platt together secretly played the key role in one of the most astonishing intelligence operations in the history of the spy wars between East and West. It is a story that is told here for the first time.